Anyways, so now, I'd like to talk about, this idea of like, Manhattan versus the rest of New York. Now, I think it's like, if how New York is kind of laid out, of course, you have Manhattan, which is like, in the middle of it all, Broadway, Wall Street, Times Square, Central Park, almost everything New York, all like the best parts of New York is always in Manhattan. But at the same time, Manhattan is also where all the rich people live. So, what we kind of see in this election, and just like in general, honestly, in New York politics, is that we kind of see this huge divide between Manhattan versus the rest of New York. The Bronx, Queens, Staten Island, all these places. So, what's immediately clear, from looking at the map is that I think it's like I looked at the one from Washington Post, for example, and you see, like Garcia and Wiley were represented with orange in this case. So Manhattan was orange. And then everything else was blue. So Eric Adams was blue, Kathryn Garcia, or, Maya Wiley in the first round was orange. So literally Manhattan chose a different candidate from everybody else. So that was really interesting. And I think it's like, so like Wiley and Garcia in general, were the favorites of Manhattan liberals. So I think ultimately, we just like how, they're women of color. That's like immediately lock in for like the white liberal vote, the rich white liberal vote. And, and just like also with their rhetoric and things like that, with like, Maya Wiley ultimately kind of like angling more towards like, like the Bernie people, because she understands that, there's a chance that she could like actually do this. So, with just her angling more towards like in like the progressive language, not policy necessarily, but, there's a language and things like that. Ultimately, that got her the progressive people on her camp, but also with Garcia, just like with kind of pander to like urban liberals, that also got people in Manhattan to her camp. So ultimately, Wiley and Garcia, like I said, were like the favorites of, like the Manhattan like liberal elite, basically. Now, because of that, we thought, it might be like, these guys, like Maya Wiley or Kathryn Garcia. But no, see, what had happened was basically the rest of New York said no. They said, Eric Adams is our guy. Now that's interesting because basically what Eric Adams has done basically is behind the scenes, as everyone's like focusing on Andrew Yang, as everyone's focusing on Maya Wiley and Kathryn Garcia, Eric Adams is behind the scenes essentially working to build a working class coalition. So now what does this look like? So basically, he would go to all these like, poorer parts of New York, the Bronx, Queens, like these areas, these boroughs, where, where a lot of the politicians, don't really like try to appeal to, don't really try to pander to. And, and he brings this message of like, being tough on crime. Now, this works particularly because I think it's like, it's not necessarily, just because of like, it's all the violence and things like that you've kind of seen with like, the protests and things like that. A lot of it is that part of it is debatable, but it was also, I think it's just in general with like how crime is in New York recently, I think crime has actually been on the rise. So a candidate that says, yes, I will be tough on crime is, very appealing. And I think it's like, so I think it's like to an extent, the fact that, the rest of New York voted for a former cop, a former police officer, you could look at that as a rebuke to the Black Lives Matter movement. But then at the same time, it's also just like the fact that, that like, like what like liberal elites in Manhattan, in LA and these places might think is like, the currents of the nation, of the national politics, might not be the case to, poorer segments of society, to even so-called peoples of color, where, where their concerns might be more, more practical, more, more real, more like mundane, like crime, like, living costs, things like that. And I think Eric Adams ultimately was able to like appeal to that segmented population, and that's how he kind of like clinched the domination ultimately. But unfortunately, even though he said the right things, even though he portrayed himself as the right figure, I think ultimately what's kind of, what's the folly of all of this is that Eric Adams isn't really like a working class guy. In a sense where it's like he's not actually there to fight for working class. So behind the scenes, he's actually, he's very much an establishment candidate. He's funded by, all these like, like PACs and these Wall Street people and things like that. So I think it's like, although in the front, he might appear as like, appear as this populist figure. I think ultimately, behind the scenes, what we kind of see is that, he's not really a populist at all, So then it's like, So I think it's like it's a case here where it's like, yeah, it's like you kind of say the right things, you do the right things, but you don't really have to actually do them when you get to office. So I think it's like, it kind of shows like ultimately, like like the decrepit state of American politics, that somebody like Eric Adams was actually able to like win by literally only saying the same things without even like actually like doing anything substantive in actually implementing the policies that will actually improve people's lives. Somebody like Andrew Yang, I guess, would have actually like had a better job of doing that. But we'll kind of discuss how Andrew Yang's campaign also didn't really pass that message on all that well. So, I think it's like just like one more thing to note, I guess, just Eric Adams in general. He likes to utilize identity politics. He's black. So I think so I think basically he likes to like use identity politics, in favor of like his own like message on like being tough on crime and all these kinds of things. And at times, whenever people slander him, he would just chalk it up to racism, which is it's a very lazy argument. And I think ultimately, I think it's like this kind of like this folly on his part didn't really do much to like hamper his campaign. And I think ultimately, his tough on crime message is ultimately what really pushed him past the finish line.